Hi Robert, this is my first video in response to your video Cargo Cults and Ghost Towns. The first thing I want to go over is the Gospels. You had mentioned the Gospels once again, and how you were still unclear as to where Jesus was both born and where he was from. And you brought up some biblical references, some scriptures, and I'll go ahead and go over those with you. I feel that the Gospels are more than clear as to, where Jesus was raised and where he was born, but we'll go ahead and go over it again, and I'll touch on those points. You brought up Matthew chapter 2. So you said that Matthew chapter 2 says that he was from Bethlehem. It's depending on what you mean by from. The scripture says that he was born in Bethlehem. It doesn't say that he was from there in a sense to that he was raised there. And this also ties in with the Gospel of Luke. But Jesus wasn't from there, as in he grew up there and lived there. We know through the Gospels that he grew up and lived in Nazareth. And you brought up, well, actually, Matthew 2:1, I'll read it. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, and then it continues from there. You mentioned Mark 6:1's reference to Jesus' hometown being Nazareth. The scripture doesn't actually say Nazareth in that scripture, in Mark 6:1, but I believe that you are right, and I would agree that it's most likely referring to Nazareth. And this is true. I don't disagree with that. Nazareth was Jesus' hometown. That's where he grew up since he was a child, and he lived there all his life. As for the scripture you use in John chapter 7, verse 41 through 43, there is no apparent contradiction or anything of scripture in those verses. It says that the people were divided, but not all the people were clued into who Jesus actually was from the scripture, or where he was from. And from that I mean from where he was born. If you look at verse 40, though, it says, on hearing his words, some of the people said, surely this man is the prophet. But others said, he is the Christ. And still others asked, how can the Christ come from Galilee? Does not the scripture say that the Christ will come from David's family? So right there we see right away that those people are unaware of the genealogy of Jesus and of his earthly father Joseph's lineage to King David. Then the scripture continuing, it says, doesn't the scripture say that Christ will come from David's family and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? So the people were divided because of Jesus, the scripture says. So it's clear that some people simply just weren't clued in to who Jesus was, or that he was even born in the town of Bethlehem, and in fact fulfilled messianic prophecy. Also, to add on the subject of Bethlehem, to say that there was a Bethlehem before, I believe you said that there was a Bethlehem before and after, but not during Christ's time, or during the time that Christ was born, is just plain asinine, in my opinion. Bethlehem was a very small town back then, with a population of only 300 people to maybe 1,000. They're not really sure. It was somewhat forested, actually, in those days, and it was on the edge of the desert and farmland. So it truly was a little town, Bethlehem. And the occupations there were mostly farmers, weavers, some stone masons in that time, in that region. But Bethlehem was there during Jesus' time that he was born. In fact, here's some history on that. Bethlehem was first settled by the Canaanite tribes, naming the city Bethlehem. They built a temple to the god Lahama on the present Mount of the Nativity. Around 1200 BCE, the Philistines had a garrison stationed in Bethlehem because of its strategic location. The city also is significant to Jews because it's the burial place of the matriarch Rachel and the birthplace of King David. Samuel anointed David king in Bethlehem, according to 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. And David was a descendant of Ruth and Boaz, who were married in Bethlehem. Following the Israelites' rule, actually, the Greeks occupied the region until the arrival of the Romans in about 160 BCE. And to add to this, I found some sources that say that there were actually 2 Bethlehems in those days. But I want to point out that not only did Matthew and Luke specify which Bethlehem Jesus was born in, but also the prophet Micah specified that the Bethlehem that Jesus was to be born in was the Bethlehem in Judea, Micah 5:2. So they even specified which Bethlehem, if there were 2, which Bethlehem Jesus was to be born in. Okay, so now on to another subject that you had brought up in your video about God's omnipotence. Of course I believe that God is omnipotent, but let me just touch on a few points concerning his omnipotence. God can do anything that is consistent with his nature. You said this yourself in your video when you were giving a definition of God's omnipotence, so I agree with you on that. But it's absurd to suggest that he can do everything. If an all-righteous, holy, good God could do evil, that would be a contradiction of his own nature. That would be like me asking you to draw a square circle simply because you have the power or the ability to draw either one. It just doesn't make any sense. So here are some things that God cannot do from Scripture. God cannot lie, according to Hebrews 6:18. He cannot be tempted, according to James 1:13. And according to Psalm 102:25-27, God cannot cease to exist. So when you think about this logically, God can do everything that is logically possible for him to do. The Bible clearly portrays God's omnipresence, but what exactly does that mean? Well, when Scripture speaks of God as omnipresent or present everywhere, as it says in Psalm 139, it's not communicating that he is physically distributed through the universe, but that he is simultaneously present with all his fullness to every part of creation, pretty much. So thus Scripture communicates God's creative and sustaining relationship to the cosmos rather than his physical location in the cosmos. To speak of God's omnipresence in terms of his physical location in the world rather than his relationship to the world has more in common with the panentheism of heretical process theology, which is currently popular in liberal circles, than with the classical Christian theism. Panentheism holds that God is intrinsically in the world, like a hand in a glove, so to speak, while classical theism holds that God properly exists outside of time and space, like it says in Isaiah 57:15. And finally, you know, the danger of speaking about God in locational terms is that it logically implies that he is by nature a material being. The Apostle John clearly communicates in John 4:24 that God is spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And I want to touch on one thing you said too. You said that God cannot be in hell if he is all good, but I'm not sure what your concept of hell is, but I'm not sure if you have a biblical view of hell in your mind, but you know, hell is not this little place where you see little red demons running around and Satan with the little horns and a little pitchfork. You know, that's definitely not what hell is. Hell is indeed a place where God can be. Hell is not a place where evil will flourish, but it's basically a place where evil is finally quenched. All hell is basically an eternal separation from, you know, God's goodness, his grace, his love to those that are there. Or that's how the scriptures explain it. But it's basically, hell is just basically the place of, you know, God's divine judgment and where his divine wrath is carried out. So you have to remember that even King David in the book of Psalms says that if I should make my bed in the depths, you know, there you are. So, you know, God God can also be in that realm as well, because like I said, hell is a place where evil will be finally quenched, and that's where God's eternal judgment is carried out. So I hope that this clears up some questions in your mind concerning God and His omnipotence. So thanks.